Hey everyone, welcome to Matters of Mind. My name is Thomas, and today I'm doing Chapter 2 of Thomas Sowell's Social Justice Fallacies. This is the second part of a series where I go through this book and chapter by chapter and talk about what the fallacies are. There's 4 total, and today is the second one. If you hit like and subscribe and that bell notification, you'll be notified when the next ones come out, and I'll put the links below in the show notes. Now, today we're talking about racial fallacies specifically that Thomas Sowell talks about here. But what he does is a little more interesting than just the numbers that we usually see. He goes through some racial fallacies, and then he really diagnoses the manner in which progressives have miscalculated, to say the least, how these fallacies work and where they come from. And the key idea here is using only one factor in determining the manner in which the world operates. Now, he goes through a little bit of time here. So in the past, what we saw was progressives tended to use only one factor to control or to justify or explain, really, the differences between racial groups, and that was race. Now they only use one factor to explain the differences between racial groups, and that's racism. So the similar thing here is only using one factor to explain all the differences instead of trying to understand more nuanced positions where race and or racism might play a factor, but it's not the only thing that determines all of the differences between racial groups. So I'll give you 2 perfect examples of how this works. The first one I'm going to read directly from the book. For example, the poverty rate among Black American families as a whole has long been higher than the poverty rate among white American families as a whole. But over a span of more than a quarter century since 1994, in no year has the annual poverty rate of Black married couple families been as high as 10%. And in no year, in more than half a century since 1959, has the national poverty rate of Americans as a whole been as low as 10%. If Black family poverty is caused by systemic racism, do racists make an exception for Blacks who are married? Do racists either know or care whether Blacks are married? Perfect example. So today, we usually hear the differences between racial groups explained as racism, in this case, systemic racism. But if you look a little bit deeper than only looking at one group versus another group and the income levels, much like we talked about in our first video, where you also have to take other factors into consideration like median age, well, in this case, if you just look at married couples compared to single people, the size of the household, the status of marriage in itself makes a difference. And when you look at Black married couples, we don't really see the disparity that we do if we look at the picture as a whole. So obviously, marriage makes a difference in income. So that's a behavior that changes the income as well. And then you can look at the marriage rates between those 2 groups and see if that then helps to explain some of the differences. But we don't go that far. What people see is, oh, there's 2 groups, they're different. The reason is racism, or in this case, systemic racism. It's using one variable to explain all differences. And that's exactly how progressivism worked prior to this. Instead of racism, it was race. So they used to use race as an explanation for the differences in racial groups. Now, the best example that I have from this chapter, I think, is the IQ differences. So now when we hear IQ differences, SAT scores, we blame the system, we blame the tests, things like that. Progressives used to just see the differences in IQ and say, oh, okay, that's proof, scientific proof, that there is a difference in intelligence between races, and that explains the differences in outcome. So they had this information as early as World War I, because during World War I, much like today, when people entered the military, they would take mental tests. Today we call it the ASVAB. Back then, I don't know what it was called, but it was a mental test that tested essentially IQ. Now, whatever you think of IQ, it's pretty damn solid. So I'm not even going to deal with that right now. But if you looked at the IQ difference between black and white soldiers entering World War I, it was very different. The white soldiers, on average, were higher than the black soldiers. So people took this as proof of the differences between the racial groups, and their outcomes was just because one group is smarter than the other. However, what they didn't do, like with the economic income data today, is look just a little bit deeper, because when they separated the states, what they found is that black soldiers in the North had higher IQ levels than white soldiers in the South. So how is it that your IQ can change from moving north as compared to south? Well, it's because they had different schools, different opportunities, different culture, environment. Everything was so different that the blacks in the North were actually testing with higher IQs. Now, your IQ doesn't change when you move across state lines. So obviously, there wasn't a difference in genetics, but they didn't take a second to look a little bit deeper. Because when you already have an idea of how the world is, and you come upon some evidence that you think might prove that, why go any further? You have it right there. Now let's leave it alone. We're done. Now that's the real interesting thing about this, is not only does Dr. Sowell go through and talk about some racial fallacies, especially when it comes to looking at data, but he also pulls it out throughout time and really helps us understand how a lot of the fallacies come from people already having preconceived ideas about what the truth is, finding a piece of evidence, and then elevating that piece of evidence as ipso facto scientific data fact that what they believe is true. And all you have to do is take a step back, look at some more detail, and really think about why those differences might be there, and not settle for one variable, one reason to explain all differences between any kind of group. Life is much more nuanced than that. It's much more complicated. Equally impressive about this idea that people used to have based on those IQ tests was who believed it. It wasn't like they were just a bunch of uneducated people who were too lazy to look at data. The American Sociological Institute, the leader of the American Economic Institute, the presidents of universities like MIT, Stanford, people across the pond as well in those institutes took this idea as the differences between racial groups had to do with their race and having higher intelligence and higher outputs because of that intelligence. So again, a lot of intellectuals were clamoring onto these ideas, propagating them, and making it seem as if it was the truth. But it didn't take that much to really dig through a little bit of the data and see that it wasn't that easy. So regardless of how smart somebody is, regardless of their education, we have a tendency to see the world in a certain way. And when we see evidence for it, people tend to take that evidence and run with it and not look any deeper. So I think it's important on all of us to be aware of that bias and make sure that when we see evidence that already makes us feel all good and tingly inside, make sure we step back and think about how we could tear that evidence apart and make sure that we're moving forward with the right idea. All right, so big deal. There are fallacies out there, right? Well, it can be a big deal. Real life, flesh and blood people are affected by ideas every day. And Dr. Sowell gives a great example. President Obama was giving a speech during his presidency and talked about a young black kid that he met. This young black kid said when he grows up, he wants to be a fighter pilot. But there's no way that the white man would allow him to fly planes in the Air Force. Now, imagine what that does to somebody. If they believe that there's a system out there that won't let them do something, they're likely going to be less motivated to do it. And not to mention that this is 6 decades beyond World War II, where we had a whole group of pilots that were all black and got famous for it, the Tuskegee Airmen. 2 of those pilots went on to be generals in the Air Force. And if you want to talk about pilots today, I mean, we have at least 17 black astronauts. So the idea that they won't let a black man fly a plane is just ridiculous beyond belief when they're doing it every day. So it is really important to address these fallacies and challenge them because they have real effects on real life, flesh and blood people. So that was chapter 2 in Dr. Sowell's book. This one was racial fallacies. Again, please like and subscribe. It really helps me to get this out to more people if there are more subscribers, and the algorithm that YouTube uses will really help to spread this to other people if you like it, and the bell notification will make sure that you know when I hit chapter 3, 4, and that would be it because there's only 4 chapters. So again, thanks for joining me here today on Matters of Mind. Hope everyone has a great day. Goodbye.